All the world chess champions without exception had one thing in common, and it has something to do with Spain. So guess what it is? It's flamenco dance, Spanish wine, or a Spanish opening. And you guessed it right, it's all three. But today we'll talk about the Spanish opening, aka the Ruy Lopez. It arises after this most common opening move sequence, and if you play this position with either side, either white or black, you gotta be ready to face the move bishop b5. We'll stay away from the main lines because they're intricate and they contain a lot of theory that you gotta know. Instead, we'll focus on the common Igor Nation stuff, which is aggressive, fun, and easy to learn. Alright, so when you play bishop b5 as white, when your opponent is not sure what to do, they usually see that you're kind of threatening this pawn on e5 because you're ready to eliminate the knight, and so often they want to either protect this pawn on e5 by going pawn to d6, or they try to chase away your bishop by playing pawn to a6. Quite often they do both. For instance, they can play a6 first, and as you drop your bishop back, they then follow up with pawn to d6. What do you do then? Well, you can simply castle because it's a useful move anyway, and it's also a little bit provocative. First off, your opponents still see that there's this unpleasant pin, and they may try to chase your bishop back. They play pawn to b5, you play bishop b3 back. And now, like, the overwhelming majority of your opponents will wish to play bishop g4. For some reason, a lot of amateur players just believe that it's so cool to have this pin on your knight, and that this will nearly guarantee future attack of black. But we'll see that we have something prepared. So first off, I always recommend that you play pawn to h3, just to make sure that the bishop decides what exactly it wants to do. Does it want to take? Does it want to go back? In most cases, they will go back. If they take, it's no problem. You play queen to f3. You're actually threatening this checkmate in one. Your queen is active, and generally speaking, bishop is a little bit stronger than a knight. You can then play pawn to c3 so that he can never jump there, and you just have a great position. But in most cases, they will instead drop their bishop back to maintain this pin. And here, when your opponent thinks that life's good, you shock them by the move knight takes e5. And that counts as a complete shocker, as unlike the normal illegal checkmate, that's actually something different. So, what's the catch here? Well, you sacrifice your queen, and it's actually going both ways, and therefore he has to take your queen or else he'll take his bishop. So after he takes your queen, you then play bishop takes f7, check to the king. There's only one move where it can possibly go to, so king goes to e7, and now knight takes c6, you rock. It's a royal fork, so you rock. Now the king has to move, now you take on d8, it's check once again. Therefore, they have to recapture, and as a result of this massive trade-off, we have two extra pawns in an endgame, and therefore that is a technically winning position. If they don't play the move bishop g4, which as we now know turns out to be incorrect, they can play a more solid looking move knight f6, and that is indeed a good move for black. Still, there are some common attacking patterns and traps involved here. There are actually two ways for you to go about this. You can play in a more solid style, just play c3, which is a usual move of the Ruy Lopez opening. You're getting ready to play d4 on the next move and put your pawns in the center of the board, thus gaining some space advantage and a nice position. Some of your opponents will see that actually this pawn on e4 is hanging, and they'll just go ahead and grab it. They'll expect you to play something like rook e1, and they're ready to drop their knight back, but instead of all that, you surprise them with bishop to d5. And you're just attacking way too many pieces across this diagonal, so you're going to be winning something. Besides the classical c3 and d4 plan of the Ruy Lopez opening, you can also switch it to the fried liver attack with knight to g5. And that's something that will confuse a lot of your opponents because you're not playing the Italian game or the two knights game where they expect you to go for this attack. You instead play the Ruy Lopez. But since your bishop relocated back to this diagonal, it's actually becoming very similar to the Italian game, and therefore you can go for this fried liver attack against this pawn. Now, how do they... No, it's a wrong arrow. Yeah, like this. So how do they defend it? You're attacking all these squares, so it's not easy. They'll play pawn to d5, now you take, and strangely enough, recapturing with a knight is a losing mistake for black, but most of your opponents will not recognize this, so they will go for that. And now you win in the standard way for the fried liver. So it's knight takes f7, temporarily sacrifice, followed by queen to f3. You're putting pressure against his king as well as the knight. Therefore, if the king wants to hide back, then you play bishop takes d5. You're threatening here the knight and the rook along this diagonal, and if he tries to go knight d4 to counterattack you, you don't want to go back, you instead go forward, and it's somewhat really close to the scholar's checkmate. What else can your opponent play? We'll start from more amateur level stuff, and after that we'll go to like more pro stuff where your opponent knows the theory and plays all the correct moves. I'll still show you how to get a nice attacking position there, but for now let's still talk about like more common moves in amateur level. Again, your opponent sees that you're putting pressure against his center, against this pawn on e5 in particular. He may wish to just defend it by playing pawn to d6. Looks simple and solid, but then he's exposing his king, and therefore this knight is getting pinned, and you can take advantage of that by striking in the center right away, d4. Now you're threatening either to take or to push forward. Once again, this bishop is putting pressure. They'll usually recapture. You recapture with a knight, attacking this knight twice. They defend it, and then you just develop. Now here your opponents will often see that if there is some unpleasant pressure that you're putting here, they'd wish to trade off some pieces to make their life easier. So they go for this, knight takes, queen takes, then they trade bishops, and now it feels like black's position is completely secure, and the most common move by black is knight to f6. Strangely enough, this move turns out to be a losing error, because you can strike back with the move pawn to e5. And this central breakthrough just wins the game. Like you attack here, plus your knight is putting pressure there just as well as your queen. And if he takes there after queen takes e5, that's a double attack to this king as well as the pawn on c7. And after they cover their king anyhow, you then play knight takes c7 check to the king, and then you trade queens, and on the next move you're going to win the rook in the corner, getting the winning material advantage. Some of your opponents will wish to go for the so-called burst defense, where they go knight to d4. This way they counterattack your bishop, and your bishop can no longer attack this knight on c6 whatsoever. What do you do then? Well, first of all, you just trade it off, and then you castle. Castling is something that you usually do early in the game, because you have developed all your queenside pieces already, and therefore you're free to castle, and now your king is safe. Now, black has little problems with his development. If he tries to bring his knight, then you can always kick it off with pawn to e5 and attack it, so it feels a little bit unpleasant. Normally, black would wish to develop this light square bishop by putting the pawn forward, but this pawn is pinned down to the king, therefore they can't play d6 right away. And, they could develop the dark square bishop, but in this case, they usually prefer to first attack your bishop with something like pawn to a6. And then you can bring the bishop back to c4. That's one of the tricks of the Ruy Lopez. As you relocate the bishop back to this diagonal, you kind of create back the Italian game situation, which allows you a lot of early attacks. For example, if your opponent plays bishop c5 here, looks like a very standard, normal, solid move, but it actually doesn't work because the bishop takes f7. And on the next move, you follow up with queen h5, which is a double attack, and you're going to get your piece back with interest. You won this pawn on f7, plus his king is completely exposed, which gives you a winning game. Many of your opponents will be tempted to play pawn to b5 because black's got a lot of pawns here, and they wish to attack your bishop, maybe even to follow up with c5, something like this. They definitely expect your bishop to just go back to b3 or something like this, but instead you still sacrifice your bishop on f7. And this is a really tricky tactic, which is nearly impossible to see if you are not familiar with this variation. So after king takes, you still play queen h5. So far black still can't get it, what's the point? But they're losing, because after they go pawn to g6, you play queen d5, and that's the point of our plan. We attack the king and the rook in the corner, therefore we're gonna win the rook, get a material advantage, plus his king is still exposed, and once again that ensures your winning advantage. Alright, what if you encounter a really advanced level opponent who knows all the theory and plays all the correct moves? Then the main line of the Ruy Lopez is pawn to a6, bishop goes back, knight f6, black is not playing b5 early, he instead just develops, and now again, the main lines of the Ruy Lopez are heavily theoretical and complex, but instead we'll go for a more aggressive approach. We'll go pawn to d4, trying to open up the game and put pressure on your opponent right away. Now clearly you attack the pawn, you're threatening to go forward, therefore in the vast majority of the cases they're going to take here, and then you castle, leaving the e-file open for your rook, which is very handy in many variations. So it's, for example, very risky for black to take this pawn because that exposes their king along the e-file, and you're going to take advantage of that. So what will black do here? Well, they have some problems. This pawn on e4 is ready to go forward and chase away this knight, which feels unpleasant. If they try to stop it by going d6, they expose their king along this diagonal, and therefore you can just go knight takes d4 and start putting pressure here to this knight. So it also, it's not the end of the world for black, but anyway, you have a nice attacking position here. In most cases, they play the move pawn to b5. That's the most played move according to the Lichess database, and guess what? This is nearly a losing error, because that relocates your bishop back to b3, and now you have those two common attacking patterns that we discussed previously together. So you're threatening either to go pawn e5 and chase away this knight, which is very uncomfortable for black, or, thanks to this bishop, you're ready to go knight g5 and hit this pawn on f7. And black is kinda defenseless against these both threats together. In most cases, they go bishop c5, getting ready to castle, which prevents your move knight to g5, because then it won't be efficient, he will simply castle, but e5 remains to be very strong. And what can he do now? He doesn't want to undevelop his knight back to g8, that's just very passive, and you'll continue attacking. Knight e4 puts this knight in a very dangerous position here in the center of the board, because you see that there are no squares where it can possibly go to, right? This square is taken by your bishop and knight, therefore there is no escape square. You can just play something like queen e2 and attack this knight, usually you can just win it. In most cases, they will go knight g4, because that looks like the only normal square for the knight, and it potentially attacks this pawn on e5, although probably not right now, because again, his king is standing there, so you can always put your rook on the e-file and attack everything that stands there. There are many ways for you to attack here. The most solid way for you is to play pawn to c3, pretending like you just want to take here and attack his bishop, and as he captures, that clears the d-file for your queen, and all of a sudden you go forward with this all-out attack, queen d5. That creates the threat to the f7 pawn, but also to the bishop on c5. And after queen e7, you can just recapture the pawn, and your position is so strong with so many threats, and black's pieces are really awkward, and with so many weaknesses all around. This knight is pinned down to the rook. This bishop on c5 is kind of hanging, you're threatening knight e4, potentially going after this bishop. You're ready to go bishop g5 to chase away this knight, this queen. You're putting pressure on this diagonal. This knight is also misplaced. Kind of everything is wrong for black. If he tries to castle, you can then go bishop g5, and now the queen has to move, and after that, you just can get this bishop on c5, which is no longer defended, and black's position falls apart. So what's the correct way for black? Indeed, black should be really careful here and play most solid moves ever. So after they take here on d4 and you castle queenside, instead of b5, which is nearly a losing error, they gotta play bishop e7 and try to castle as quickly as possible, and then they ensure their safety. You still play pawn to e5 just to gain a tempo, and after the knight goes forward, in this case it is safe for black to do that because the knight cannot be trapped, it can escape through this square. Then you can just get back your pawn on d4, and after all, that's just an equal game. If black does something normal, if they take here or if they castle, that's an approximately normal, equal middle game position, and that's fine because, chess is a draw if both sides play correct moves, but in reality both sides play incorrect moves consistently, and that's what makes chess fun. So, what if your pawn decides to take this pawn instead? Looks kind of a juicy pawn. It looks like black's king is now really well defended and black has nothing to worry about. But in this case, that's still wrong because you can go rook e1. And even though you're not going after his king, you're going against these two knights. And you're kind of skewing them, you're going to win one of them. Black can't even play pawn to d5 because this pawn is pinned. Like a little nuance that actually does not help black to just play d5 and feel good. Similarly, they can't play f5 because your knight controls the square. So they have to actually just give up one of these knights. So let's say they go knight c5. The only attempt to save a piece is to counterattack. Then you take their knight, they take your bishop, and for a second it feels like black is cool, but then you play knight f5, and it turns out that you still win a piece along this e-file. Thanks to the knight attack, and the bishop is pinned, there's nothing they can do. So they usually try to simply castle, at least to put their king to safety. But then you take on e7, check to the king goes to the corner, and now first of all you're up a piece already, therefore that is generally speaking already a winning advantage. But the cool thing is that you can play queen h5. And now you have a bunch of pieces near the opponent's castling position, and all of a sudden black can't stop your winning attack. And by the way, here's a little question for you. What if black goes pawn to d6? How would you finish white's attack here? If you can find it, please let me know in the comments below. That covers the Spanish opening for white, and if you want to know how to counter the Spanish game, then I've got another video just about that, and you can check it out now. Also, if you have any requests for my next videos, which subjects or which openings you wish me to cover, please let me know in the comments below. And make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on those future videos. Take care, talk soon.